February 13, 1993, Lynn DeJac's 13-year-old daughter Crystallynn was found strangled to death in their Buffalo home. Lynn was convicted of murdering her own child despite zero physical evidence connecting her to the crime. She spent 13 years in prison, gave birth to twins behind bars, and became the first woman in American history to be exonerated of murder based on DNA evidence, only to discover the real killer was the man she had warned police about from the beginning. February 13, 1993. Valentine's Day weekend in Buffalo, New York. 13-year-old Crystallynn Girard was home alone while her mother, Lynn DeJac, went out for the evening with her boyfriend of 2 months, Dennis Donohue. What happened that night would destroy 2 families, expose fatal flaws in the criminal justice system, and make Lynn DeJac a historic figure in American legal history, but not in the way anyone could have imagined. Crystallynn died near midnight on February 13, 1993, or in the early hours of February 14. She was found naked on her bed and medical examiner ruled that she had been strangled. Crystallynn had cocaine in her system, but the medical examiner determined it was not enough to kill her. When Lynn DeJac returned home that night, she found her daughter dead. The nightmare had only just begun. To understand how Lynn DeJac ended up spending 13 years in prison for a murder she didn't commit, you need to understand what happened the night Crystallynn died. The night of Crystallynn's death, DeJac and her boyfriend of 2 months, Dennis Donohue, went to a bar and had a large fight after DeJac discovered he had paid someone to have her followed. The relationship between Lynn DeJac and Dennis Donohue had been troubled from the start. Donohue was controlling, possessive, and had been stalking Lynn. The discovery that he had paid someone to follow her was the final straw. According to later testimony, the fight at the bar that night was loud, public, and ended with Lynn leaving Donohue. Multiple witnesses would later confirm they were at the bar miles from Lynn's home during the time window when Crystallynn was murdered. When Lynn returned home and discovered her daughter's body, she immediately called police. And she immediately told them who she believed was responsible. DeJac told the police that Donohue had stalked her and murdered her daughter. This is where the wrongful conviction of Lynn DeJac truly begins. Despite her immediate identification of a viable suspect with a history of violence and stalking, despite the lack of any physical evidence connecting her to the crime, and despite an alibi placing her miles away at the time of the murder, police decided Lynn DeJac was their primary suspect. The prosecution's case against Lynn DeJac was built entirely on speculation and theory, with zero physical evidence. DeJac was not implicated by any physical or forensic evidence. There was no DNA evidence linking Lynn to the crime scene. No fingerprints. No witnesses placing her at the scene during the time of the murder. No forensic evidence of any kind connecting her to her daughter's death. What the prosecution did have was a theory that Lynn had killed her daughter in a drug-fueled rage, that she had strangled Crystallynn and then staged the scene to look like someone else had done it. The theory ignored several crucial facts. Lynn had an alibi, multiple witnesses placed her at the bar with Donohue. The time window for the murder didn't match Lynn's whereabouts. Dennis Donohue had a history of violence and had been stalking Lynn. Lynn had immediately named Donohue as a suspect. But prosecutors were convinced they had their killer. In 1994, Lynn DeJac went on trial for the murder of her own daughter. DeJac was pregnant during the trial, gave birth to twin boys while incarcerated, and later married the boys' father, Chuck Peters, while still a prisoner. The image of a pregnant woman on trial for allegedly murdering her teenage daughter was powerful courtroom theater. The prosecution used it to paint Lynn as an unstable mother who had killed one child and was now bringing more children into the world. The defense argued that Lynn was innocent, that she had been miles away when Crystallynn died, and that Dennis Donohue was the real killer. But without DNA evidence to prove Donohue's involvement, the defense struggled to overcome the prosecution's narrative. Lynn DeJac was convicted of second-degree murder and sentenced to 25 years to life in prison. She maintained her innocence from the moment of her arrest through her conviction and every day of her incarceration. Ms. Lynn DeJac shouted, "I didn't do this." She had given birth to twin boys while behind bars and later married their father, Chuck Peters, while serving her sentence. Lynn DeJac gave birth to twin boys while in prison. The babies were immediately taken from her and placed with their father, Chuck Peters. She would spend years fighting not just to prove her innocence, but to be reunited with her children. She married Chuck Peters while still incarcerated, in a prison ceremony. He believed in her innocence and stood by her throughout her incarceration. She also had an older, estranged son, Edward. The conviction had shattered Lynn's family. She had lost one daughter to murder, another son to estrangement, and her twin boys to the prison system that took them at birth. For 13 years, Lynn DeJac maintained her innocence. For 13 years, she insisted that Dennis Donohue had killed Crystallynn. For 13 years, the system ignored her. By 2007, Lynn DeJac had spent over a decade in prison. Her twin sons were now teenagers. She had missed their entire childhood. But advances in DNA technology were about to change everything. The Innocence Project, a non-profit legal organization dedicated to exonerating wrongly convicted people through DNA testing, agreed to take Lynn's case. They requested DNA testing of evidence that had been collected from Crystalynn's body but never properly analyzed. What the DNA tests revealed would vindicate everything Lynn DeJac had been saying for 13 years. The DNA evidence found on Crystalynn's body didn't match Lynn DeJac. It matched Dennis Donohue, the man Lynn had told police from the very beginning was responsible for her daughter's murder. Lynn DeJac was released from custody in Buffalo, New York, today after serving 13 years in prison for the murder of her 13-year-old daughter, a crime she has always maintained she did not commit. She was released today after a judge granted her a new trial because DNA evidence has created the possibility of a new verdict. On November 28, 2007, Lynn DeJac walked out of prison a free woman. DeJac, according to the Innocence Project, became the first woman to be exonerated of murdering someone based on DNA evidence. Lynn DeJac made history that day. She became the first woman in American history to be exonerated of murder charges based on DNA evidence. It was a landmark moment for wrongful conviction cases and for women fighting against a justice system that had failed them. But freedom came with complications. The medical examiner's office, in a move that shocked Lynn and her attorneys, changed Crystalynn's cause of death from strangulation to drug overdose. On her first full day of freedom since being cleared by DNA evidence of the 1993 murder of her daughter, Lynn DeJac said that she can't be at peace until the real killer is brought to justice and a new autopsy finding that the girl died of an overdose is reversed. "It's very hard to accept the fact they're now putting this on the death certificate," DeJac told today's Meredith Vieira. The change in cause of death meant that Dennis Donohue couldn't be charged with Crystalynn's murder. If she died of an overdose rather than strangulation, there was technically no murder to prosecute. It appeared that the system, having failed to convict the right person once, was now protecting itself from acknowledging how catastrophically it had failed Lynn DeJac and her daughter. Despite the changed cause of death, investigators continued building a case against Dennis Donohue. And what they discovered was even more disturbing than anyone had imagined. Dennis P. Donohue, the man accused of strangling a South Buffalo woman 14 years ago, may be a serial murderer responsible for killing two other females in 1975 and 1993. Investigators began connecting Donohue to other unsolved murders in the Buffalo area. The DNA evidence that had exonerated Lynn DeJac also linked Donohue to the 1993 murder of Joan Giambra, another woman who had been strangled to death. Donohue, who is currently serving 25 years to life in prison for the murder of Joan Giambra. Dennis Donohue was eventually convicted of Joan Giambra's murder and sentenced to 25 years to life in prison. He was never charged with Crystalynn's murder due to the changed cause of death, but the DNA evidence made clear what Lynn had known all along: Donohue was a killer, and he had murdered her daughter. Lynn DeJac's fight didn't end with her exoneration. She filed a lawsuit against the state of New York for her wrongful conviction and the 13 years of her life that had been stolen. DeJac Peters settles state lawsuit for $2.7 million. In 2012, Lynn reached a settlement with the state for $2.7 million. No amount of money could return the 13 years she had lost, the childhood of her twin sons she had missed, or the daughter who had been murdered. But it was an acknowledgement, however inadequate, of the injustice she had suffered. Lynn was finally able to reunite with her twin sons, now young adults. She married Chuck Peters, the father of her twins who had stood by her throughout her incarceration. She tried to rebuild the life that had been destroyed by a wrongful conviction. A woman who spent more than 13 years in prison until being cleared of strangling her teenage daughter died Wednesday of cancer. Lynn DeJac Peters, 50, died at her Buffalo home in the presence of her husband, Chuck Peters, and their now 20-year-old twin sons. On June 18, 2014, Lynn DeJac Peters died of cancer at her Buffalo home. She was just 50 years old. She was surrounded by her husband and her twin sons when she passed away.